This program is presented by University of California Television. Like what you learn? Visit our website or follow us on Facebook and Twitter to keep up with the latest UCTV programs.
Welcome to A Conversation with History. I'm Harry Chrysler of the Institute of International Studies. Our guest today is Michael Walzer, who is Professor Emeritus in the School of Social Science at the Institute for Advanced Study. One of America's foremost political thinkers, Michael Walzer has written about a wide variety of topics in political theory and moral philosophy. His books include Just and Unjust Wars, On Toleration, and Arguing About War. He has served as editor of the political journal Dissent for more than 3 decades. His most recent book is In God's Shadow, Politics in the Hebrew Bible. Professor Walzer, welcome to Berkeley.
Thank you.
Where were you born and raised?
I was born in the Bronx, but when I was 9 years old, my family moved to Johnstown, Pennsylvania, a steel town east of Pittsburgh, and that's where I grew up.
And so was conversation at the dinner table about all sorts of world events, current events, domestic politics?
We talked about politics. We talked about the place we lived in, and the high school and the temple. Beth Zion Temple was the Reform Temple in Johnstown. And they made sure that I understood that I was a part of not only a family, but a community, and this was the Jewish community in Johnstown.
What about teachers before you went to college? I mean, who was the most influential in terms of directing you beyond what we've just talked about?
Well, the high school was not a bad high school in the suburb of Johnstown called Westmont, where the Bethlehem Steel executives lived and some Jewish merchants and doctors. It wasn't a bad high school. The teachers were serious. The school divided between it was a consolidated school, so quite literally half the boys went to college and the other half went to Korea. So you learned a lot about the American class system just by being in that school. But there was no particular teacher that I was especially close to.
Where did you do your undergraduate work?
At Brandeis University, again arranged by the Reform rabbi in Johnstown, who made a called Sacker, and got me a scholarship. We couldn't have afforded to go to Johnstown. I couldn't have afforded without that. And Brandeis was really it was an incredible experience of just opening up an intellectual world and a political world.
And at that time, it was a relatively new university, which was the contribution of the Jewish community to higher education.
Yes. And it had a very large number of red diaper babies and a very large number of faculty members who were, who because of McCarthyism, probably couldn't have taught anywhere else.
Mm-hmm. And at Brandeis, who were your primary faculty mentors?
I had some wonderful teachers at Brandeis. I think Frank Manuel may have been the most important. He was an intellectual historian. Irving Howe and Lou Kozer, the founders of Dissent magazine, were both teachers of mine. Marie Serkin helped consolidate my Zionism. She was the the daughter of, what's his name? Nachman Sirkin.
Prominent Zionist intellectual.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I had other teachers. Herbert Marcuse was there at the time. I didn't study with him, but I listened to him talk at various occasions. I wrote my senior honors essay with David Berkowitz, who was a historian of the early modern period.
And what was that on?
It was on the Puritans, and I stuck with the Puritans for some years. I like to say that I wrote about the Puritan Revolution in England because I was a young lefty. I wanted to write about a revolution, and my French wasn't good enough.
So what do you think was the primary legacy of Brandeis in sort of shaping your intellectual development?
Well, first of all, Brandeis was the place where the 60s began in the 50s. We were politically active, engaged, because of the faculty and because of who the kids there were, before the rest of the country. But in a similar way, the Montgomery bus boycott of '54, I think, had resonated in Brandeis like in no other American university. So I learned a certain kind of politics, and the politics of my parents was sort of the Popular Front. They voted Democratic, but they read PM and I.F. Stone's Weekly and that sort of thing. At Brandeis, I learned that you could be an anti-communist leftist, which was which was the politics of the founders of Dissent magazine, and they were my primary mentors.
And that was an important contribution not only to your development but also to thinking, intellectual currents of thought in the United States on the left, right?
Yes.
To make that separation.
Yes.
Were you politically active at Brandeis?
Yes. I ran for president of student council and won. I wrote for the Justice, the student newspaper, and we formed a political organization that was called SPEAK, Student Political Education and Action Committee. More education than action, but it was an early version of SDS.
And you mentioned McCarthyism because that was the evil force at that time in the United States. What was the political activity against McCarthy at Brandeis then?
Well, we were all too far to the left. I mean, I actually heard McCarthy speak in Johnstown. Mm-hmm. He spoke on at a fairground outside of the city. I went with a friend who was a Republican and got a very good sense of how a demagogue sounds.
Was that frightening for you at that time?
It was frightening to me a little, yes, and not at all to my Republican friend. And maybe it was less frightening to me because I was with him and he wasn't frightened. Yeah, I think if I think about politics at Brandeis, I think we were already one step further into America than our parents had been. During the Rosenberg trial, I remember my parents and other Jews of their age were scared that this was very, very bad news for American Jews. Mm-hmm. At Brandeis, we circulated and signed petitions against the death penalty for the Rosenbergs without being afraid, which I took as, or I take now as suggesting that we were a little more
Assimilated?
not exactly assimilated. You couldn't quite be assimilated at Brandeis, which was 95% Jewish. But we were more comfortable in this country.
In your book on social critics, you talk about the importance of understanding the national language, the political tradition, the culture. This education at Brandeis that you've just described and this step away from the way your parents behaved, that sounds like that's part of that. In other words, as part of your development, you're learning to argue in the national idiom. Is that fair? I mean, it wasn't that this frightened you, but you wanted to speak out against it, and you had a right to do that.
Yes, I think that's right. I think that, first of all, it helped to have become an anti-communist. That helped naturalize you into American political life, and it for me it was very important to remain a leftist while making that move. Yeah, well, when I went to yes, I think you're right. I think that Brandeis was America, a very odd,
A very
piece
Jewish
of it,
America,
but still
yeah.
America.
Now, I'm curious, let's go back to you hearing McCarthy. How would you, did he have a sense of the American idiom in some very negative way? Tell me again about that. In other words, could you at that point or in retrospect see how he could appeal to some Americans who weren't educated at Brandeis, say?
I suppose so. Populism is an appeal to the populace, and it's an appeal in the language of the people. And McCarthy was playing on the fears produced by the Cold War, and doing it very effectively.
And what was, just one other question, what was the reaction, do you recall the reaction of the crowd to him?
No, I don't have, that's...
But your friend liked him, your
Yes.
Republican friend, yeah.
Or at least my Republican friend was not, he was closer to an Eisenhower Republican than to a McCarthy. So he would be a little uneasy, but not upset the way I was at hearing this man. And
then, now where did you do your graduate work?
I had a Fulbright from Brandeis to England, Judy and I married before we went to England because our parents wouldn't have let us go together without getting married. This was 1957, 56, 57. And we went to Cambridge for a year, where I began my graduate work. I studied with Jeffrey Elton was my tutor. He was a historian of Tudor England, and he didn't do intellectual history, but he let me do it. He was a very sweet man, and I read English history, 16th, 17th century English history, for that year in Cambridge. That was the year of the Suez War, and I remember going to demonstrations against Suez, and that was also the summer after our year in England was the first time we went to Israel. We went to Israel the summer of 1957.
And what was that experience like?
Well, it was a very, very important, moving experience. Israel was still a new place, a far more egalitarian place than it is now, a smaller country than it is now, and a very, very attractive country. We were very poor students. We hitchhiked around the country, staying in the cheapest hotels. And we were there for 6 weeks, I think, or something like that.
Before we talk about where you got your, well, let's talk about, you then went on to Harvard where you
Yes.
did your PhD.
Right.
And who was that under and what was it on?
I was in the government department, although I'd been a history major at Brandeis. Frank Manuel, who had friends at Harvard, told me that political science was the right discipline because it wasn't a discipline, and I could do anything I wanted if I went into political science, whereas if I went into history, I'd have to spend hours in archives, et cetera. So I majored in, I went into the government department. I did political theory. My primary mentor and protector was Sam Beer, who was a British historian, but who also was a theorist, and Louis Hartz, with whom I studied American political
Who wrote one of the
theory.
most important books on American political
Yes,
culture.
the liberal tradition in America, yes.
And what did you do your dissertation on?
My dissertation was on the Puritan Revolution, continuing what I'd done in Cambridge, England, and at Brandeis. And Sam Beer was my thesis advisor, and pretty much let me do what I wanted to do. So I started in Geneva, and I read Calvin, and but I focused on the English Puritans and the revolution of the 1640s and the killing of the king and the establishment of the Cromwellian Commonwealth. Yes, and then I attempted to compare that to later revolutions in France and Russia.
Mm-hmm. And what was your main conclusion?
Well, that Puritanism was the earliest form of Western radical revolutionary politics, and that what we identify as the repressive features of Puritanism were features also of Jacobinism and Bolshevism, and they reappear in secular versions later on.
I like to ask my guests the skills and the temperament involved in the work they do. Now, you are a political theorist, but you're also a social critic, and you combine those two roles. So talk a little about the skill set involved in these two undertakings.
Well, I've recently written a piece on what I call the political theory license. Political theorists, in contrast to most other academics, have a license to have opinions and to defend their opinions in the classroom and in academic journals in the way other people are not supposed to do. So I could give a course on socialism, which was a defense of socialism, and that was a perfectly legitimate thing for a political theorist to do, but wouldn't have been okay for a political scientist or a historian. So the crucial thing is to have opinions, I guess, and to be eager to explain them and defend them, the great thing about the profession that I chose is that I could literally write an article in defense of some political position, that the Vietnam War was unjust, say. And after I wrote it, I could decide if I wanted to publish it in a political magazine like Dissent or an academic journal. If I was going to publish it in an academic journal, I would have to add 25 footnotes and maybe muddy the prose a little bit. But essentially, I could go either way with, and that's what made possible, I think, my life in the academic world. That I didn't have to pretend to be an objective scientist, social scientist. That I was, by virtue of being a political theorist, I was also a political intellectual, and I could function that way. Getting through graduate school, it was very, very important to me that I could write for Dissent as a graduate student, because the graduate school is a terrible time. Here you have this young, open-minded, very bright kids, these kids who come, and then the graduate school, the aim of the graduate school is to narrow them down, to shape them into professionals. And good people resist that, and Dissent made it possible for me to live in both, to live in the academic world, but also outside of it. And being a political theorist, I was able to do that all my life.
But what distinguishes a social critic that makes him different from what you just described you were able to do as a political theorist?
Well, no, I think.
Or are they the same because of the way you pursued it?
Yes, I think they are very, very much the same, except that I had this image, you've already referred to it, of a social critic has to be socialized, naturalized into the society he's criticizing. Why criticize that society? But presumably it's because you want you want that place to be a better place. So you have some commitment to and loyalty to that place that you're criticizing, and that's the reason you're criticizing it. So I always tried, and Irving Howe was very important in helping me learn how to do this. I always tried to write in a very simple and direct English. I never became, I never adopted any of the fashionable jargons of political theory. I wasn't a Straussian, and I wasn't a follower of Derrida, and I wasn't a German high critic, critical theory. I wrote in the academic journals in the same way that I wrote in Dissent, and it was the English. We always used to read Orwell's piece on writing in the English language, and that was our commitment, and so political theory. I never thought of myself as writing academic political theory.
What about temperament? You said you had opinions and you could express them. So does that involve courage and certainty about taking positions?
I don't think my courage was ever tested. I never really experienced, I didn't experience McCarthyite repression. I always lived in a world where even if my view was a minority view, it was a tolerated minority view. Nothing that I said ever endangered my job security. So courage, I don't know. I mean, you never know how much courage you have until you need it.
Other qualities of temperament, though, that come to mind?
Well, I always thought that one of the things that distinguished me from some of my colleagues in political theory was that I was more willing to be wrong. I wasn't afraid of taking positions that might turn out to be wrong. So I don't know. I think it is important to be able to write the English language. I was never any good at any other language.
Did you learn to write at Brandeis, or was that earlier?
I started writing earlier. We did write in high school. And I had, this must be my parents, at age 13, I wrote, published a little journal, magazine for my friends and relatives called Between the Lines, in which I defended political positions of various kinds that I had learned from my parents.
I'm curious, as a theorist and as a social critic, what do you see as the impact of your Jewish education and the Jewish tradition on, you know, your stance as a political theorist and as a social critic?
Well, I guess like a lot of other people in my generation, I sort of grew up thinking that Judaism and the socialism were sort of the same thing. Now, that's not right. And working on the Jewish political tradition, as I've been doing now for some 20 years, you learn that there were many, many different points of view in the Jewish community, and that basically the community was very conservative because of its vulnerability and its fearfulness, which produce conservative politics. It was only after emancipation, and only in the West, really, or Russia and the West, that you got Jewish radicalism. But that Jewish radicalism was the world that I grew up in. I don't know. It owes something to the experience of the Jews as a persecuted minority, and it also owes something to the literature of the Jews, to the prophets, and even to Talmudic modes of argument. You know, it was the Talmudic rabbis very, very early on who decided, before anyone else was doing this, to preserve the dissenting opinions, because, as one of them said, they might turn out to be right. So that there is something in the tradition, but there's also, I think, most importantly, it's the experience of being a minority, and the commitment of lefty Jewish kids in the 60s to the Black Civil Rights Movement comes directly out of that sense that that we were like them.
So, and I do want to point out, you wrote your first article for Dissent when you were at Brandeis, correct?
In the summer after my senior year. I was working as a research assistant for Irving Howe and Louis Koser, who were writing a history of the American Communist Party, a critical history. And I read every issue of the Daily Worker from the 1920s through the 1940s, taking notes for their book. And and I wrote my first article was on the response, a critical piece on the response of American communists to Khrushchev's famous speech. That was my first article. But the most important My first important pieces in dissent were written in 1960 when Irving sent me south to talk to the students who were sitting in at lunch counters in North Carolina.
And what was that experience like?
Well, it was extraordinary. I mean, it was Irving before me who sensed that this was something that was going to be very, very important. And he asked me to go down there. And I flew down. And I went first to, I think, Shaw University, which was one of the first places. And I talked to the students, and I wrote about them. And occasionally I spoke. I went in February of 1960, and then again in April to Alabama and Georgia. And I spoke at some meetings. I brought them expressions of solidarity from the students of Harvard University who had not authorized me to do that. And I wrote about it, and then I helped to organize the Boston part of the what was called the Northern Support Movement. So we picketed Woolworths, they were sitting in at Woolworth lunch counters in the South. We picketed Woolworths in the North. And we had an organization called EPIC, the Emergency Public Integration Committee. And at the height, we were picketing 40 Woolworth stores with college students from the whole of the Boston area, organized from Brandeis and Harvard. And so that became a very, very important part of my life. And then the experience of being, when the black nationalists took over, the Jews were more or less politely invited to leave, which was something that you had to learn from, or try to learn from, because after all, it was their civil rights movement.
Would it be fair to say, to assert, I'll assert something and then you can knock it down, that as a political theorist, you draw more on the Talmudic tradition. You tap that vein, whereas as a social critic, it's more of the prophetic strain in Judaism. Is that fair, or am I conflating things, or what?
I didn't really start studying the Talmud until I got to the Institute in 1980 and decided to work on this Jewish political tradition project. And,
but it might have been in your DNA.
It might have been. A certain tradition of argument, I think, is in the cultural DNA of most Jews. But I was trained. I read Hobbes, Locke, Rousseau. I mean, I was very much an American political theorist who happened to be Jewish. And only, I think I only came slowly to realize the impact of my Judaism on my politics. When someone said to me once, this wasn't a fair comment, but it shook me a bit, that really everything I'd written was driven by first the Jewish experience as a minority, and then by the Jewish experience as in an embattled state in the Middle East. So I certainly think that my writing about pluralism, about dissent, about community, that has a lot to do with my experience as an American Jew.
You write in your book on social critics The critic exposes the false appearances of his own society. He gives expression to his people's deepest sense of how they ought to live, and he insists that there are other forms of falseness and other equally legitimate hopes and aspirations. Reflect on that a little, because it's really a philosophy that guided dissent over time.
I became I became a student of hypocrisy, and a serious student of hypocrisy, because I didn't like the kind of social criticism where the critic claims to have access to some universal truths, and he stands on the mountaintop and wags his finger at his fellow citizens who don't know those truths. That kind of social criticism I never liked. And I always believed that the duty of the critic was to remind people of their own highest ideals. And these highest ideals, in many ways, are revealed in hypocrisy. Hypocrisy is the tribute that vice pays to virtue. It therefore implies that the people who are acting viciously know and at least pretend to be committed to the virtues. And you have to remind them of that commitment. And if you want to be an immanent critic, a critic from inside your own culture, your own society, a critic who is one of the people, like Achad Ha'am, who is one of the people. If you want to be a critic like that, you have to study the ideals that your own people fail to live up to, but believe in some way.
And power is, in a way, something that doesn't go with social criticism. I mean, once you attach yourself to power, then do you cease being a social critic?
Well, you can't get too close. You can't become an apologist for the powerful. But after all, you do want to change things, and in order to change things, you need agency, and agency implies power. So you want people like yourself, maybe people who are better at politics, better at kissing babies and shouting slogans at meetings, and you want people who have your views to win power, and then when they do, you don't want to become apologists for them, but you are supporters of what you hope they're trying to do, and then critics if they're not trying hard enough, or critics of the compromises they make. So I always thought, in contrast to the guy on the mountaintop wagging his finger, that critical distance should be measured in inches, not in miles.
Is that role frustrating? I mean, if we look at the 99% movement, which followed the economic collapse, which followed the election of Obama, who ran on an agenda of hope, and I guess a social critic might find more in that hope than was actually realized. When you just talked about the civil rights movement, there you were really an activist, and you were building things and made things happen. And maybe there was less frustration in what you could accomplish in the North at Woolworths. Talk a little about that, because how does the social critic deal with these times when the ideas, the critique of the society, it doesn't result in well, let's put it this way, it's less than satisfactory implementation.
Yes, certainly. We have the dissent crew, our political group has experienced many defeats in the last decades. My two bouts of periods of political activism were in the civil rights movement and then in the anti-war movement. And you know, each of them had some limited success, but they set up, they opened the way for a rightward drift, which has been more or less continuous from the mid 70s right up to the present. The country has moved much farther to the right than we could have imagined in the 70s, and it does have something to do with the left of the 60s. I was co-chair of the Cambridge Neighborhood Committee on Vietnam, which organized in Cambridge, Massachusetts, against the war. And we forced a referendum on the war in November of '67, the ballot. And we lost. We got 40% of the vote against the war in the city of Cambridge. And then a graduate student in sociology did a survey of the vote. And what he discovered was the higher the value of your house, the higher the rent you paid, the more likely you were to vote against the war. We lost all the working class ethnic sections of Cambridge. And that was, there you saw the beginnings of the Reagan Democrats, the drift away from, which was partly because of we were thought to be anti-patriotic, and we were campaigning against a war that their kids were fighting. And the Harvard students who weren't fighting it. So I think it's important in thinking about the rightward drift of the country. When a leftist thinks about the rightward drift of the country, there is some self-criticism that has to be a part of that story, which doesn't make our politics less frustrating. What we are doing is trying to sustain a certain tradition of egalitarian leftism, in the hope that there will be a next generation that will pick this up. And the Occupy movement was, up to a point, encouraging. It wasn't political enough.
But why self-criticism? In what sense? I mean,
well, of the kind of leftists who carried Viet Cong banners or spelled America with a K.
I see.
And deliberately set out to alienate themselves from to provoke their fellow citizens, and achieved that in ways that we paid for later on.
So it was a loss of the national idiom. We're back to this whole thing of being part of the community, but standing outside of it in a critical way.
Yes.
The other of your many important works, you've done very important work in theory on just and unjust wars. And you write about the Vietnam period and those years of angry controversy. I promised myself that one day I would try to set out the moral argument about war in a quiet and reflective way. I want to defend the business of arguing in moral terms. And this book on unjust war results may be taken as an apology for our occasional carelessness and vindication of our fundamental enterprise. That's what you...
Yes.
And so, as a theorist, now I assume in that book you're wearing primarily the hat of a theorist. You take historical cases and try to help us understand the intellectual dimensions of the various aspects of different kinds of war.
Right. The book is an argument about when to fight and how to fight, but it's also an argument about how to write about issues of that kind, and I was committed to using historical examples rather than hypotheticals. So I was not writing in the idiom of the philosophy of those years, which was very abstract and full of these weird hypothetical cases. I wanted to talk about the experience of war, and I spent 5 years reading military history and the memoirs of soldiers, novels and poems about the experience of war and the company of soldiers before I started to write.
And so the argument about the morality of different kinds of war has to take account of when the tire hits the road. I mean, what the actual cases were, what
Yes.
the choices actors were confronted with, and their moral dilemmas.
Yes, it's very much, it tries to say, it tries to ask the question, is this a war we should fight? Or is this a technology we should use? Or is this a strategy we should use in fighting it? It tries to ask that question from the standpoint of the people making those decisions.
Since the end of the Cold War, we've been confronted with a whole set of new categories of kinds of wars: humanitarian intervention, drones, terrorism, which requires rethinking. Is rethinking the word, or continuing the process that you had already identified, looking at the cases, laying out the important questions, and posing the moral dilemmas?
Yeah, I in the 70s, when I wrote Just and Unjust Wars, I already included a chapter on humanitarian intervention and a chapter on terrorism, because there had already been examples of what I take to be humanitarian intervention. The Vietnamese went into Cambodia to shut down the killing fields of the Khmer Rouge, and the Indians went into what became Bangladesh to stop the Pakistani terror there. So I was already, I wrote about humanitarian intervention, and I defended it in extremis. When there was a massacre going on, you have to stop that. And I wrote, we were already living with the terrorism of the IRA and the FLN in Algeria and the PLO in Palestine, Israel. And I had very strong views about that. What is different now is the practice of the experience of asymmetric warfare, which would describe Vietnam, but it's now, there are now more wars of that sort, and we've been forced to think a lot more about how to fight against an enemy that attacks your civilian population and hides among its own civilians. And how do you fight against an enemy of that kind? And that's the experience of the U.S. in Afghanistan or Israel in Gaza, and it's not easy.
In looking at that book, I was struck by the fact that when you're talking about humanitarian intervention, you go back to John Stuart Mill. So he actually set the agenda, basically, and really defined the issue.
Yes, his essay called "On Non-Intervention" is the starting point of this debate.
And I guess the other issue that becomes very important is the way we have embraced technology in warfare as a way to conduct the war with the least damage to our soldiers, but targeting the killing of leaders on the other side. And you recently wrote about that in Dissent.
Yes, I've been trying to write more extensively about drones, I don't think I do think that when you're involved in a struggle against terrorist organizations, that the people who plan and organize and carry out terrorist attacks on civilian populations are legitimate targets. So I thought that in the 1970s, and I think it now. The difficulty with it, and if you can attack them without putting your own soldiers at risk, there doesn't seem any good reason not to do that. The difficulty with drones is that it's such an attractive technology for soldiers. The killing is so easy compared to having to get a sniper into place or a commando raid on an encampment in Pakistan or Afghanistan, that you overuse the technology. You begin lowering the standards for its use. And that's what happened with us with the drones. We began by using them again very carefully against quite specific targets, and then we loosened the criteria because it was so easy. And now I think Obama, at least he has said, that we're now tightening the criteria again, which is what we should never have loosened them.
If we look at the case of Syria, that's the other item on everyone's agenda. That case is very complicated in terms of humanitarian intervention. You, I think the preface of the latest edition of your book, you lay out a series of questions, and there at a certain point, there seems to be a need for a turning point. That what at one point one might conclude no intervention, over time, then it becomes an open question. Is that a fair way to state it, or at least it raises more moral ambiguity?
You want political struggles to be settled by the people who are going to have to live with the settlement. So the basic policy when you confront a political struggle, an anti-tyrannical rebellion, is not to intervene, because these people have to settle this among themselves. The exceptions are massacres, mass killing as in Rwanda or in Cambodia. Massacres should be stopped by anybody who can stop them. And I would include massive ethnic cleansing and massive enslavement of populations, but these have to be activities on a large scale where you can see that the people at risk have no capacity to protect themselves, and so that you need an external force to protect them. Syria is a civil war. It's not a massacre like Rwanda. Half the casualties are on the government side and half on the side of the rebels. It's not, and the government is more cruel. Syria seems to be more cruel, but it's not. This is not like Cambodia or Rwanda or Darfur. It's another story, and how you intervene in a struggle of this kind is very, very difficult to figure out. Right now, it seems to me what is most necessary is a much more forceful diplomatic offensive to arrange a ceasefire, because of the humanitarian crisis, which is being caused by all of the contending forces, not by one force. The humanitarian crisis has reached proportions where half the population of Syria is now displaced, at risk of disease and malnutrition. So yes, now there is a turning point, but it's not like just going into the way the Vietnamese went into Cambodia and just overthrew the regime. Overthrowing Assad might deliver the population into the hands of jihadi militants who are as cruel as he is. So it needs a different kind of intervention, more diplomatic, more negotiated, but the humanitarian aid has to be massive now, and we're nowhere near doing what we ought to be doing.
What do you see as the relation of theory to practice? In other words, in writing a book like this, and obviously there are new editions as time passes, is the hope that it will clarify the choices that policymakers make, or is it more back to the Vietnam case of educating the people, just the people who want to think about the war and what their government is doing?
Well, you always have two aims. You want to influence the people who make the decisions, and to my great astonishment, Just and Unjust Wars was adopted as a required text at West Point, which was totally unexpected by me and led to many visits to the academy and many meetings with the officers there who had adopted the text, all of whom were Vietnam veterans who had been shaken by the experience. So you certainly want to be read by the people who become practitioners in the field. But you're also trying to shape the critical debate, the judgments that your fellow citizens will make about these wars and the way the arguments will be developed.
One final question. If students were to watch this interview, what do you think they might learn from this intellectual journey that you have made? Are there lessons for them for the future?
Well, if you're in the academy, don't lose your connections to the world outside. Don't treat it as an ivory tower or a haven for people like us, but remain engaged with the people outside. I think, and yeah, I don't know. Write in an English that is accessible to those people, and not just to your fellow graduate students. Remain connected.
Well, on that note, Professor Walter, thank you for taking the time to be here today. It was a great honor to talk to you about your intellectual journey.
Thank you for giving me this opportunity.
And thank you very much for joining us for this conversation with history.